Stephen King is one of those writers who have almost become legends in their own right. I think Stephen King as a writer is almost as iconic or as trademarked as someone like Batman or Superman. He's everywhere. He takes bestseller to a whole new level. He's a brand in and of himself. In the past couple of years, I've been trying to dip my toe into more and more horror, and I have had a great time with it, but I have never tried one of the granddaddies of the genre, and I feel like I'm missing a really big chunk of my personal educate myself in horror journey. I feel like I need to try at least some Stephen King books and see how I get on with them. I hope I'm gonna love them all, but I'm not gonna assume that. A lot of them are quite old. I'm gonna assume they're dated, and he's written like 70 something books, and some of those are chunky books. So while I've definitely seen a lot of recommendations that you start at the beginning, work your way through, catch all the cameos and references, see his writing style evolve, I'm not gonna be doing that to myself. I'm going to be picking specific books, the ones that I think I am most likely, based on my own personal reading taste, to enjoy the most. And then I'll work my way down into the ones that feel maybe more like a stretch, if I think that, as a rule, I trust King's writing and want to try even some of those less compelling ideas. I have spent a lot of time narrowing my choices down. I asked for recommendations on Blue Sky, I've watched a lot of YouTube videos, I've spoke to some people in the comments. For the very first time that I'm reading Stephen King, I've decided to try and hedge my bets. I know that he writes largely horror with a supernatural bend, but I also know that he writes some horror that doesn't have a supernatural bend, some crime fiction, some more, I guess, literary work, things that, and I think there's even some fantasy in there. So what I'm going to do is pick the book that I have been the most recommended, the one that seems to come in those top 5s and top 3s the most often, the one that, as a topic of vampires, is the most likely, I think, to appeal to me as a reader. So for the kind of supernatural set, I'm gonna read Salem's Lot. On the other side of it, I did consider doing one of his fantasies. Again, that's where my real interest lies. And I know there's a couple of options. I could do The Dark Tower, but I've decided to go down one of the more realistic books, one of the less fantastical, less horror ones. I guess it's not crime either. I guess maybe this is just literary fiction, but I know my mum's favourite movie is The Shawshank Redemption, so I'm going to read Rita Hayworth and The Shawshank Redemption. Who knew it had a different title? And then I'm really hoping that I'm going to get on to the film version of Shawshank and hopefully one of the films of Salem's Lot. I have lots of places I can branch out and go, but I think that reading these two very different books should maybe help me decide what type of focus to move through as I explore more and more of Stephen King's writing. Before I dive into the first book, I just want to put out there that I would quite like to do more videos like this. I definitely want to do more Stephen King. I'm thinking that at a minimum I'll do at least 2, which would maybe give me 4 or 5 books. So please, if you're a horror fan or a Stephen King fan, or I guess if you're not but want to kind of play the opposite side, then leave me your recommendations for which books I should consider in the comments. Similarly, I'd really like to try this kind of project with other authors, real staples in their genre that I just happen to have dodged in all my reading years. So if you've got an author that you just think exemplifies their genre, they're just like, that author is that genre, whether you like them or not, then let me know those as well, because I'd love to try maybe genres that aren't usually mine by way of an author that is considered to be at the peak of that genre, if that makes sense. While you're getting on with that, I will read the first half of Shawshank Redemption, and when we come back, I'll let you know what I think. I decided to start with The Shawshank Redemption because it was the shorter of the two, which I didn't realise. I had in my head that The Shawshank Redemption would be quite a big, gritty book. I don't know if I'm going to be getting it confused with The Green Mile or something else from King's back catalogue, but I just didn't realise that this was a novella that I think clocked in round about 180 pages. I also didn't realise that The Shawshank Redemption isn't the original title. When I picked this one up, I actually had to do a bit of digging around because I thought I had got the wrong book. This is actually called Rita Hayworth and The Shawshank Redemption, although I think it's probably been renamed officially since the movie came out, which I do still need to watch, which I'm hoping that I'll get to before the end of this vlog so that I can let you know what I think of it as an adaptation. Being so short and not having too many speculative elements in it, this one was a really quick read and probably a really good place to start my Stephen King journey. I had a really good time with this one. Being shorter obviously helped. It did feel like it flew in as opposed to some of those really massive books that I've seen in his backlist, some of the ones that are really intimidating. I didn't pick this one because it was small. I picked it because the movie is so well known, because I thought I had a rough idea what I was getting into, but it's a nice happenstance. The story, if you by some miracle don't know, is told to us by Red, an inmate at the Shawshank Correctional Facility. Red is the guy who can get things, and because of this he's approached by a new prisoner. He tells us about how he met Andy Dufresne, a mild-mannered accountant who is brought in after he is convicted of killing his wife and the man she was having an affair with. And he sort of tells us little snippets of his and Andy's interactions through the 20 odd years that they are incarcerated together. He tells us little snippets from Shawshank, how Andy comes in, he's able to help them out with some financial situations they're in, how he works his way up to helping out how he works his way up through the ranks. He's helping out the warden, he gets slightly preferential treatment, he gets his own cell, he's able to build up the prison library, and through all this how he and Red's friendship kind of develops. Now, I did have a rough idea what the plot of the movie or the book was, so I kind of saw what was coming. It wasn't a massive surprise to me when the point of this is all of these little events tied together, and I sort of saw the writing on the wall of it all culminating in Andy's escape. Without that drip of pop culture, then maybe it would have felt more like a massive reveal. Maybe it would have felt more like a surprise or a twist when Andy's disappearance is revealed. But honestly, I don't think that knowing that took away from the story, because I think that the hints are fairly steady throughout. They're fairly upfront. I don't think that King is trying to hide that moment from you. It's a kind of inevitability. I was honestly more surprised when Red tells us after the fact that some of those early moments he thinks were before Andy came up with his escape attempt, because when we're told about them they do feel like things that might be related, such as him coming to Red for the rock hammer, him having the interest in rocks and stones. I kind of suspected that that was part of the breakout plan right then and there, so I don't think that my enjoyment was hampered in any way by knowing where the story was going. I really enjoyed Red's voice throughout the story. I really enjoyed the picture he paints of Shawshank as a setting, the mundanity of it, the bleakness of it, but also people just kind of trying to get by, trying to have hope. I thought it was really well done. There's not a huge amount of depth to any of the characters. We do obviously get a little bit more about Andy. We get a decent picture of him as a person, but he's such a buttoned up character that we only ever really see what's on the surface, and we have to guess at what's going on underneath, as Red does, because of what is revealed. Similarly, Red spends most of his time focused on telling Andy's story. He does say at one point that we might think that this hasn't been his story. He's reduced himself to a minor character in his own narrative. But he says that no, because Andy is almost the other part of himself, the part that still hopes, and that this is very much his story too. It does mean though that because Red is so focused on telling Andy's story and Andy is such a buttoned up character, Neither of our protagonists really feel like people we get to know deeply, that we get to really immerse ourselves in. The reader is left to make a lot of assumptions about both of them as people, and I think that worked. I think it maybe ties in with that incarceration theme. Red talks about how controlled their lives are. If you spend a long time institutionalized, then you become an institution man. You struggle to readjust to having your own choices and your own freedoms. And I wonder if the idea of that buttoned upness, the idea of not really knowing other people too well, of having to be wary about the threats that are maybe in prison with you, all of that kind of ties together and helps us as the reader feel some of that Shawshank claustrophobia that Andy is obviously experiencing throughout his tenure there as an innocent man that is victimized and then has to build himself his own little empire of accountancy work and favors in order to create a sense of protection for himself that again he then risks in a really bold but really quiet way by making this escape attempt that takes years to pull off and could be revealed at any moment. He's a really interesting character in that kind of duality. The choice to escape is so bold, it's so risky, but at the same time we see how careful and considered he is, how mild-mannered he is, what a long-term planner he is, in that he does it for years, in that he builds this network of favours, in that he already, before he even came into the prison, had a nest egg set up on the basis that one day he would be free. I personally found him really compelling, and I do find it interesting that while we don't really know much about Red, the narrator, there's something in the voiciness and the way that he tells the story that really draws you in, that makes him feel like quite a comforting presence in the narrative. I can see why someone like Andy would be drawn to Red and why they would develop a bond during their time together. The Shawshank Redemption probably isn't the type of book I would usually have picked up if I wasn't looking to try Stephen King, but I had a really good time with it. I don't know that I would go as far as a 5-star, but I think it's a solid 4, if not a 4.5. Like a really good story. And honestly, I can't even tell you why, because yeah, the plot on its basis is fairly impressive. You have a prison break going on, and told in almost these vignettes, these moments throughout the years. It doesn't feel like a plot driven book. It feels far more like a character study maybe of Andy even, rather than of Red. And as I said, we don't get a huge amount of depth into the characters, which I would expect in a character driven novel. Whether it was the narrative voice, whether it was just having to unravel the pieces, that inevitability, seeing how those little moments all tied together, I'm not entirely sure. But either way, it really did work. The calm, quiet angle of it, it felt very confident as an author. It felt very like someone who doesn't need to pull out a lot of bells and whistles, someone who is very good at their craft and knows what they're doing. I'm not sure where this comes in terms of the timeline of Stephen King's writing, whether this is one of his, whether this is one of his early works, whether it's more once he was a household name. But I think the lack of drama, the lack of big action scenes that you could have put in a prison break novel, the lack of, I want to say there's even a lack of, there is mention of violence, and I should mention that there is a brief description kind of told almost secondhand of gang rape in prison. But at the same time, despite that, it doesn't feel like an overly violent book. It doesn't feel like a book that is setting out to shock you or to horrify you. And I think it would be very easy to have done that with the setting. And that can be really good too. Like, I really enjoy Oz as a TV series, especially in its early seasons, which now I think about it, Tobias probably feels like maybe was inspired a bit by Andy in this novel. But that show really does go ham for the horrors of prison life. It gets ridiculous as it goes on, but the first couple of seasons are fairly solid. This I don't think did that, and I think that shows in a way King's confidence. He doesn't feel that he needs to do that. So I would be fairly certain that this maybe comes once he's had at least a few really successful novels under his belt, but that's something I would have to look up. The next book that I'm going to be picking up for this vlog is a real change of pace in just about every way possible. I told you before, the next one I'm going to read is Salem's Lot. This is a vampire book and it's a really chunky one, so this is definitely a change from Shawshank, but I think there might be a movie adaptation of this one too. I'm fairly certain there will be. Either a movie or a TV show, there must be something. So potentially I could read this and then watch both the media adaptations, whether they're movies or shows, and get back to you and let you know how I feel about those as well in comparison to the books. So I actually went right on ahead and finished up the movie version of Shawshank Redemption, and I had a really good time with it. I do think I have maybe seen it in the past, but my memory of it was practically non-existent, and it was definitely the events of the book that I was recalling rather than any real recollection of the film. I think the film as a whole is a great adaptation of the book. It covered all of the main events that I wanted to see, all of the instances that Red had talked about, the little interactions with Andy, with the other prisoners, events that happened at Shawshank over the years. I didn't feel that there was anything in the book that I wanted to see that was missed out. There were a couple of additions and some changes made. The additions were fine, I didn't mind them. If anything, they maybe gave a little more personality to Andy especially. They maybe looked to pad out Red and Andy's relationship with the other inmates, but I could probably have taken them or left them. And to be honest, one of the minor critiques I would have of the film is that it did feel a little bit drawn out in some places, especially as we got to the point where Tommy appeared in the prison. I was kind of starting to think that we should be building towards a finale. That obviously happens and that worked fine, but it could have just been a little more truncated before we got to that. I certainly wasn't bored. At no point did I pick up my phone, which honestly, for a 2-hour something runtime at this point is practically unheard of, but I was really hooked, I was really immersed. I didn't feel a need to check anything or to doom scroll. So I'm not saying that the movie ran over long, but I did at some points just feel the pacing dragged ever so slightly, which is interesting that it probably took longer to watch the film than it did to read the book. There were sort of two big categories I think you could lump the adjustments or the adaptation changes that I spotted and really kind of had thoughts about. Neither of them are negative, and there are probably some smaller changes scattered in, but these are the two that I thought were important changes that I can see why the filmmakers did it. They made sense to me. The first was taking some of Red's struggles once he is released at the end of the book and giving them as a sort of intermission section to Boone. I thought this was really smart. Stacking more at the end with Red struggling to adapt would have made the movie feel far too drawn out at that end point. It made sense to move that little slowdown more centrally into the film so that you could bracket it with some of the more exciting events that are happening to the inmates. The other big change is the resolution of the events around Tommy and then sort of that spiralling out into the finale. In the book, he gets a minimum security prison with a weekend release program in exchange for keeping his mouth shut about Andy's potential innocence. In the movie, it's much more brutal, it's much harsher. We actually see him be ready to testify on Andy's behalf and be gunned down by one of the guards at the behest of the warden, who is stood right there next to him at the time. And I can see why this worked better for film. It made it more dramatic. It made the warden definitely more of a villain. In the book, he's a bad guy, he's manipulating things, he's taking advantage and making money on the side. But the movie, having him not only order this execution but be there as it happens and then go back to Andy and be like, well, that was a sad thing but get back to work, really makes him just much more sociopathic. It makes him a true villain that you really want to then see his downfall. From a storytelling point of view, it gave you more of a push on Andy's final motivations. After this point is really where we see Andy sort of, you can tell that that's the decision made, he's going to escape, and from there the events kind of roll into place. In the book, until we have it explained to us that while Andy could have hired lawyers, he really didn't want anyone digging too deeply into what he was up to. The option is there in the reader's mind that there's still a potential for someone to speak to Tommy, for that to come out, and for that to be what propels Andy to eventual freedom. In the movie, we have completely taken away that option from him. He now only has two choices. He is either going to escape or he's going to serve out his time. And quite frankly, with what the warden has now shown himself to be willing to do to keep Andy under control and under his thumb and doing these, you know, financial manipulations for him, the chances that Andy is ever getting out in any kind of legitimate way basically seems like a non-starter now. So you can see why, as risky as escape is, it's now something that the story is telling us he has to do. There's no other way out. And it makes sense for that to be the final push as we go into that finale moment. We also got to see that escape dramatised. Red does tell us in the book what he thinks happened, but it's a visual element on screen, so we actually get to see it play out. And that really helped me. I had struggled a little bit to envision exactly the inner workings of the building. Once Andy gets through that first 6 inches of concrete that is his cell wall, he then is into the kind of bowels of the building, all the pipes, all the infrastructure, and he then is able to escape out through the sewer. And I think in my mind, I just struggled to imagine these passageways a little bit. I struggled to fully understand what would be happening once you were through that first bit of concrete. And obviously seeing it played out made it much clearer in my mind. It made the physicality of it, the hard physical work of it, of having to climb and to drop and to swim through the sewers, much more vivid and much kind of more, I don't want to say appreciated it more, but I definitely saw how much hard work that would have been in a way that I personally was just struggling to envision a little bit from the book. So for me, that was definitely a positive choice. And then the ending, again, there's just a bit more drama in the film than there is in the book. We see the sirens go off. We see the warden shouting at people to find him. We see, once the warden's schemes are revealed, the police cars massing on the prison with their sirens blaring. We hear gunshots going off. We see guards being taken away in handcuffs. The whole thing is just much more dramatic in the film, which I think you probably needed. You can't have quite a soft ending in a movie like this, whereas the book pulls that off. Because I'd read the book recently, I was not maybe surprised by the events, and it felt quite soothing and quite comforting to watch them play out. Maybe I would have been more excited, but instead what I got to do while having that soothing repetition was to really admire the film itself. Specifically all the visual choices that obviously aren't a factor in the book, but are really important when it comes to filmmaking. And I thought that Shawshank was a beautiful film. I loved some of the overhead shots when we got to see the prisoners milling around, or different shots of vans coming and going. It was all really beautifully choreographed from above. It looked very elegant in the way that movement happened. I loved the really clean colour palette that was so consistent throughout the film. The entire film is shades of greys and blues, and although there are lots of neutrals, beiges and browns, those are still cool toned neutrals. The whole movie really goes into that. Yes, a lot of that is in the nature of the film, those prison uniforms being that bluey colour, the stonework of the prison being that grey or beige depending on where we are in the setting. But there are also lots of costume moments where people aren't in uniform, the warden, or even sometimes the prisoners themselves wear odds and ends. Those could have been any colour that the costume department wanted, but they still stuck to that colour palette they had, and it just made the whole movie look so beautifully designed, so cohesive. And it gave even more impact to the scene at the end, when we see Red and Andy on the beach, we come back to blue and beige as a colour palette, but instead of being a very cool tone, it's a very warm tone, and it really shows that contrast between the mundane, almost lifeless world inside Shawshank and this bright, joyful world now that they're free. I thought that colour palette was just such a beautiful choice. It made the movie so immersive and just, again, I think almost relaxing to watch. There was nothing jarring on the screen. Between the colours and some of those choreographed motions, the whole thing just felt very artistic, very well planned, very confident from a filmmaker's perspective. Much in the same way that I said that Shawshank as a book felt very confident from an author's point of view, I think that Shawshank as a film feels very confident from a filmmaker's point of view. All things considered, it's probably one of the best adaptations that I've ever seen. So to step away from Shawshank and all of the hardened reality, the grittiness of that world, we're now jumping into Salem's Lot. At the moment I am about here, so this is chapter 4 and around page 100 and something of about 500. So I guess it's about a quarter of the way through the book, maybe just under that, and I'm having a good time with it so far. It definitely has a very lazy pace to it. It's very much macro level storytelling. We are in the town of Jerusalem's Lot, or Salem's Lot as it gets called. It's small town Americana. Everyone knows everyone else's business in this town, and we're getting to see that from multiple different angles, from multiple different people's perspectives. And now for me personally, that has been a little bit tricky to keep up with. There are a lot of characters, a lot of names being thrown around, even names that aren't really important but are kind of being used to set some history or some tone to the kind of events that have happened in the town's past or the way that people view things. I've yet to really come across any of the paranormal or horror aspects that I had been expecting from the book. I picked this one for this vlog partly because it comes so often in that kind of top 3, top 5 when people put out their Stephen King lists, but also because I've seen it listed as his scariest horror, which when there's 70 plus books he's written, I know not all of them are horror, but he's written 70 plus books, his scariest horror is a hell of a claim to make. The fact that we've not come across any of the paranormal or horror moments yet, I'm not saying it's concerning, but it's surprising. But I'm definitely getting a real sense of the setting. There's definitely a sense of danger in the air. We talk about the Marsden house that looms over the town. In the recent past, the characters we have now, maybe their childhood, this house belonged to someone that was considered to be out there, who killed himself, who set up traps within the house for when people came in. There's definitely an element of danger and an element of suspense, and something with this house is very much set up to be happening. We just don't know what yet. And it really does feel like a bubbling pot, like a good opportunity for a place where terrible things potentially might happen because everyone is so on edge. Pacing's been really good. It is split into, I think it's 3 parts for the full length of the book. So those are obviously really big. The chapters themselves are also relatively long, but the chapters then are subdivided into kind of numbered sections, and those are very short and choppy. So the book does feel very pacey because although we're not switching chapters very often, we are switching between these little inter-chapter sections. So it gives you that feel of short chapters. We haven't spent that long with anyone in particular, and at the moment I'm just struggling to find someone who I can really latch onto for stakes and for, you know, investment. But there's lots of possibilities there, so I'm hoping as I go into that second act soon that one of these characters is really going to stand out to me and I'm going to be able to follow them through the story. Another thing that I'm really kind of interested to see how it plays out is women in this. Shawshank was an all-male cast, and I did wonder how books written by a man, in this case in 75, were going to handle the representation of women. So far there's only been a couple of female characters, but we have seen them, and yeah, they're coming across as fairly stereotypical cardboard cutouts fitting into really clear almost archetypes, but the men are fairly similar too. I don't know yet whether it's a lack of depth in building female characters, or it's just that at this point the book is so broad that we're really not getting too much detail on any character in particular. So overall, not blowing my mind yet, but I'm definitely firing through it. It's an enjoyable reading experience. Again, the writing feels easy to read. It doesn't feel like it's too clunky or too awkward. In terms of page, I feel like I've read less than I have, if that makes sense, because I don't feel like I've read 100 pages. Those 100 pages have really flown in. So while I was really intimidated by how big the book is, I actually think it'll be a really easy, fairly quick read as long as I stay as engaged as I currently am. I'm not even actually sure that I'm going to edit this bit in, but I thought I should probably stick in an update for myself anyway. I'm sitting at, I think, the halfway mark of Salem's Lot. In my book, it doesn't look exactly like the halfway mark because I seem to have some extra stuff at the end of mine. I've got the epilogue, then I've got One for the Road, which is like 25 pages, then Jerusalem's Lot, which is another 50 pages, and then about 50 pages worth of deleted scenes. So that does explain why the book is so chunky, and that's a little reassuring because if I'm not loving it, then I probably just won't read all that bonus material. And I'm not loving it at the moment. I'm more invested than I was the last time I checked in. I'm really liking the author, the writer, Ben, who's come back to town as an adult. So I guess he's filling this kind of awkward role of both. He grew up in the town like the locals, but he has a different perspective because he's also being seen very much as an outsider now. But he does know the town's history, he does have an idea of the people. He's not actually an outsider. He's, I guess, this kind of prodigal son idea. He's come back because he's an author. There's this awkward juxtaposition around how people see him. They kind of seem to think of him as being maybe quite snooty or overly educated or something along those lines, where he doesn't seem to be doing brilliantly as an author. He actually seems to be really struggling. But he's interesting and I'm invested in him. Tied to him, we have the woman that he's seeing, Susan, and I really like her. She's the one, her mum is one of the ones that has all these attitudes towards Ben being kind of, he doesn't belong here. She doesn't want him for her daughter. She would rather her daughter stuck with kind of a local boy. But I really like Susan and I really like Ben and I really like them together. There's quite a nice relationship dynamic there. It feels very wholesome in a way that I think probably is quite of its time. In the last update, I talked about how the town really felt like it was embracing that kind of distressed Americana, and I feel like Ben and Susan's relationship fits that vibe. Matt, who is he's slightly older, he's a school teacher and he is kind of befriended more so Ben, and the two of them have been sharing their very nudge nudge wink wink, I think maybe there's a vampire upstairs in the bedroom moment. And I really like Matt. I am hoping that I haven't just seen his kind of last moments, but yeah, the three of them I think are the characters that I'm most invested in. And the atmosphere's starting to get a little creepier. We definitely now are getting that vampires are a concern and it's starting to build that atmosphere and tension. It's still not particularly spooky. I've definitely read things that have been more chilling, so I'm waiting to see if that amps up because there is still quite a chunk of the book to go, and I'm trying to also remember that there's been probably 50 years of books and movies using this as part of their inspiration, using this as a launching pad for new ideas. It's maybe not going to feel revolutionary as a modern reader. I just don't know that I have much to add, so I might cut this out. It probably depends on how that last half of the book goes. If my opinions are so different, that it will be interesting to compare it to this point. But at the moment, it's fine. It's fine. But I'm not loving it. It's fine. I feel like I'm about to have my library card revoked or commit some kind of dire bookish sin. But Salem's Lot wasn't a winner for me. It's hard to put my finger on what didn't work. I think I can more accurately say what did work, and I can talk about those in a minute. But despite the things that I did think were really well done, that I can really appreciate, I just didn't enjoy the book. I didn't feel like I was excited to get back to it. The beginning is very, very slow, and I think even people that have enjoyed the book do say that the beginning is very, very slow. And I wouldn't have a problem with that if I had maybe felt more connected to the characters. And even once the action started to pick up, the end has so much happening in it. That last part is really, really dramatic, but I had just reached a point where I didn't particularly care. And I don't know what that spark that was missing, but it just didn't catch me the way I needed it to. It wasn't holding my attention. I felt myself drifting and having to drag myself back to the story. I struggled to connect with it, which is a real shame when I compare it to Shawshank, where I was so fully invested. Even though there wasn't a massive plot line happening for most of that book, quite a lot at the beginning felt like it was snippets and little vignettes from Red's life, his observations in the prison, and yet I was more engaged than I was with this. I did find a lot of things to really appreciate about it, and I think that's why personally I'm really struggling to rate it, because I can see a lot of good things that the book does. They just didn't excite me. I just didn't like the book. A slow beginning, the atmosphere that builds up, the tension, the getting to know all of these different people, that really small town, small community in each other's pockets. A town that is in the process of maybe seeing its last days as young people start to drift off to bigger cities. All of that was so well painted. And then that subtle idea of something not being quite right, something wrong is creeping towards us. All of that was really, really well done. And I can appreciate that. It just didn't grab me. I was a bit unsure how I was going to feel about King's portrayal of women. And there were definitely some sketchy moments, but there were some sketchy moments in quite a lot of his portrayals. And considering this is from 1975, I think it could have been worse. I came out thinking of Susan as a really determined character, really optimistic, really confident. She was determined to do what she wanted to do, to carve her own path, no matter what that took. She was brave, she put herself forward, she was definitely willing to be the first through the door. She was a great character, I really enjoyed her, and I was very sad about what happened to her. However, although I was sad about what happened to Susan, I was sad about what happened to all the characters that bad things happened to, I did like that this doesn't have a happy ending. Or at least I don't see it as a happy ending. I liked that tragedy of it all. I liked that King didn't feel a need to pull a third act turnaround, have the cavalry charge in, or have one of our characters think of an absolutely genius solution. It does all end in tears. It ends in a kind of the best we can hope for type of scenario, and I thought that was a good choice. It made this feel more grounded, more realistic, rather than some glitzy Hollywood flash in the pan ending. Tied to that was the idea that we didn't have any real vampire hunters in this. I think they do point out one of the M's, it's either Matt or Mike or Mark. There were too many characters with names that started with M, I will say that for certain. But the older teacher character, I think there is someone kind of says something like, oh, you know, in that moment he reminded me of someone. He gets compared to Van Helsing. I didn't think they were. They were, I mean, having read Dracula, Van Helsing is also a bit incompetent, but if we're gonna go with the idea that Van Helsing is this, you know, genius vampire hunter, then nobody in this was hitting that. They were all a bit useless, but that worked. They were realistic. This was, what if vampires turned up in your town? They don't have a superhero or someone with ex-military training that just so happens to be here. Some, you know, the town librarian hasn't secretly always been aware of the occult and is just waiting for their moment to shine. The closest we get is a young boy and his like of kind of Hammer horror B-movies. There's not someone ready to ride in on a white horse and save the day. This is people doing the best they can, figuring things out and kind of messing it up, but keeping going. And I love that kind of struggle to succeed, that idea that it's everyday people taking these risks because they want to protect the people they care about, the town they care about. This isn't a save the world scenario, this is a protecting the people you love scenario, no matter what the risk. And so it comes off maybe as a little inept. It's not a last grand stand and we all go out in glory, and I actually did like that. I also really liked that the vampirism in this felt really unique. We have quite a lot of characters in the novel that are struggling in some way. Like say infection, illness, maybe depression or drug addiction, alcoholism, any of those kind of social ills. You could see this vampirism as being used as that, in the way that it moves from one character to another and kind of drains the life out of its source before moving on. It creeps like a shadow across the town. I really love that. I think it was really interesting to see the change of vampirism, the transfer of vampirism, framed more as a group problem, a social problem, something that is affecting the town as a whole, rather than in most books it's a very individual problem. We have our vampire and we have their victim, and their victim is almost then removed from society at large. They're set against society, they become something else, or they struggle against the vampire either on their own or maybe with, you know, one or two trusted friends. But this very much felt like the town, Salem's Lot or Jerusalem's Lot, was its own entity, and it was the town that was being infected, that was slowly being corrupted and drawn over to this darker side. And I really liked that feeling of vampirism as something communal, that kind of infection taking out the whole town, rather than, yes, it went through each individual, but it felt broader than that. And I think that's partly to do with the writing, the fact that from the beginning we had so many characters, we took such a macro view of the storytelling, we dipped in and out, and we would have characters that maybe only appeared as a line. We would see them doing something very, very briefly, and then they'd maybe be mentioned later, but they weren't a starring role. And I think that gave a real sense of all these different lives happening in these mundane little ways, and how what happens to the town affects them all, whether or not they were aware of it, whether or not they are the ones that are out trying to do something about it. They're kind of one entity and they all go down together. And I did enjoy that. I thought it was a really interesting take. Lots of things it did really well and I enjoyed. I just came out of it kind of shrugging my shoulders and, you know, it was fine. Which, it was fine isn't really the reaction I was wanting from this book that I've heard so many great things about. And because I can point to those great things, it's really annoying that I just didn't feel it in my soul. So I do think that I'm going to read more from Stephen King in the future. I loved Shawshank, I loved the book, and I loved the adaptation. I thought it was a great time. Salem's Lot I had really high hopes for, but there are other King books out there that still appeal to me, and since at the moment I'm sitting sort of 50-50, I definitely think I will be reading at least another couple of his books to really give it a chance, since he's so beloved. What I might do though is focus on maybe some of his more realistic and grounded horrors, maybe even some of his crime novels, rather than picking out another really paranormal one. With all the hype that King has earned and created over the years, this just felt like a letdown. And so, although I planned to look up adaptations of this the way I did with Shawshank, I found out that there are a couple of movies. There's the original 1970 something film, and there's a more modern adaptation. I think there's also a TV adaptation, but none of them were available on any of the streaming services that I have, so I would have had to pay for them. And yeah, it wasn't much, but considering I didn't particularly like the book, and the IMDb scores for the more modern films for the TV show were pretty dire, I don't really see the need to put myself through that. I think it would just be time wasted. I was almost sold when I noticed that David Soul was in the original movie, because my man Hutch wouldn't do me wrong, but even with an actor that plays a character I love, I don't think it's gonna win me over, and I kind of don't want to pay for the privilege. So I think I'm just gonna draw a line under it. So that was my first experience reading Stephen King, and I think we can see that it's been a bit of a mixed bag. Shawshank, I would put up there. It's definitely in the upper 4s, maybe not quite 5, but there's really no reason for it not to be a 5. That's purely instinct. I had a great time with that book. I really enjoyed it. I thought he pulled off such a good story in such a short amount of time. I had no idea before reading it that Shawshank was such a short book. It's such a well-loved story and such a well-known story. I just assumed that it would be a 400-pager or something. So I'm really, really surprised and really, you know, impressed by that. And then we have Salem's Lot, which I think we have fairly well covered now. If you'd like to see more videos like this, if you want to see me tackle either more specifically Stephen King books or more of these kind of iconic in their genre authors, then do let me know your suggestions both for those vlogs and for the specific books you would recommend for them in the comments. Let me know everything you have to say about the Shawshank Redemption and Salem's Lot, whether that is the books or any of the adaptions. Definitely let me know if there is a Salem's Lot adaptation that you personally think stands out above the rest, if there's one that you think is worth watching, even if I didn't love the book, because I can make the effort then and give it a go for myself. If you just want to show that you got to this stage in the video, that you survived all of the horror along the way, then leave me a vampire emoji. I really appreciate every like on these videos, and if you're interested in seeing any of those future vlogs or anything else that I put out, then please subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.